Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we're going to talk about code reading, paradigms, and mobbing. What do you mean by this, Austin?
Yeah. So this kind of came from reflections on mobbing full time for 6 years, and being in the kind of refactoring community, maybe a little bit longer than that. And one really cool thing about pairing and mobbing is if you have psychological safety and you're writing and reading code together, it's kind of a glimpse into someone else's mind and how they read code, right? And it's been quite fascinating because it's almost kind of like a UI UX experiment, right? Someone goes into a clean room and then they are presented software and they click around and you see what they do. And so uh, as you mob with the team, and if you kind of sit in the back of the room a little bit, you can kind of see how the team interprets and reads code. And one thing I've noticed is that uh, even in the so-called refactoring community, people who like refactoring and are into it, there are still a lot of habits kind of sitting around for how you read code. And what's fascinating to me is I'll hit two ends of the spectrum to make it polarized. Obviously, there's a lot of people in the middle, but to kind of help explain what I've seen when you read code, right? So on one end of the spectrum is basically wanting to understand everything right out the gate. You know what I mean? And so what is the code? The code is the sum total of all the implementation details for anything the software is doing, right? So you come into some code, and so for me to understand this code, I need to understand every last instruction and then come back to it and decide what to do, right? And so what I've noticed is if someone has that style of code reading, they are very frustrated by extracted methods and extracted classes. And so on one end of the spectrum, it's like any kind of extraction at all is very frustrating. And then maybe more in the middle of the spectrum is they'll tolerate a certain level of extraction, but too much in their mind, and they're quite frustrated. And from what I learned, and this was kind of the revelation that I wanted to talk to you about and share, is when I watched them read the code, it hit me recently that they're frustrated because they'll come into some code, and let's say it might have been 100 lines long, and it's refactored into, like, let's say 3 or 4 method extractions, just to give a random example. So what they do is when they read the code, if you let them navigate or just like let them peruse, is instead of like reading the high level of those 4 functions and being like, okay, what do we want to do? Oh, it's more like in this function, we're going to make a change or something. They will spend time going into each function, reading all of it, trying to keep that in their mind, come back out to the top level, go to the second function, go into the second function, try to read all of it, and then come back out. And so by the end of it, they're trying to keep, I don't know, 100 lines in their head and everything that's going on with that code. And so that is kind of on one end of the code reading paradigm. And then on the other end, I'll just call it like Zen extreme abstraction or something like that, where all that's on the page is all that you try to understand, right? So if it's like, if I'm reading method A, I kind of block out the rest of the world and I'm just trying to understand the name of the method is this, it has these inputs, it does these 3 things, and then it has this output. And I'm not trying to keep anything else in my head going at the time. And then it's almost like a stack where okay, we did that. Is there any changes to make in this method? No. Okay, then pop the stack. My mind is free. We go into another method and then start all over,
Hmm.
right? And so the stack is always very empty or has one thing in it.
Right.
um, so I guess I've realized those two reading styles as I've mobbed and paired with people. I don't know. What have your experiences been like?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely uh a reality is that some people want that full context. I think there are ways to efficiently do that. So where I've seen that done effectively is somebody will go in and inline every function. And so it's all combined and then undo the inlines so that you can just kind of read it in one fell swoop rather than navigating in and out of all of the functions. So
Right.
I think that way you can be kind of faster at that. But at some level, you're just gonna have to trust that whatever lower level API you've called is doing the thing it says it's going to do. So Um, you know, I think that either can be a learned behavior, right? So it's like if you trust that the naming was done correctly, then you can trust the code and let go of the rest of the stack, so to speak. But it also, I think the opposite's true, where like when looking at legacy code, I think, my thing was I would always be paranoid about these patterns that were really useful in the past that have turned out to bite us in the future. So, namely like whenever I've been in a VB.NET code base and there are try catches with the exceptions being swallowed, and then the system just tries to recover without actually figuring out what was wrong. And so, you could, that erodes the trust that the developer has with the rest of the system because you look at the next method and you don't know if the previous method basically had thrown an exception and swallowed it. And now you're in a completely unknown state, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So I could see reasons why you would want to know the whole context. But uh, you know, but also these two types of people working together could probably be very frustrating too, because you have the person that wants to know everything and the person that wants to ignore everything, um, and trying to collaborate. So I certainly think that there's a dichotomy there, but um, yeah, I do feel like a lot of it has to do with trust, right? It's like how many times have you been punished for trusting that a method did what it said it did? And for the people that that's frequent for, I think that they're probably like, okay, let's expand every method, make sure everything's doing what it said it did, come back in. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like if you've been bitten by a dog before, you don't want to,
Right,
be around dogs, right? So if you've read a method name and believed it, and that's led to bad things, you start ignoring the method names, I suppose, right? Yeah.
right. Yeah. So it's like, how much do you trust that the rest of the code base? And if you don't trust it at all, then I think generally you're much more likely to, either inspect everything that leads up to that point or try and make it so that all of the inputs that you're expecting are actually what they were. And kind of some of the worst that I've seen is like, let's remove this try catch and let the exception bubble up. And it's like, oh, the next method above that is also in a try catch, and the next method above that is also in a try catch, and the next method above that is also in the try catch. And so, without looking at like every single line in the code base, you actually don't know where the state of the application could have gone off the rails.
Mm.
So there might be situations where that's a reasonable thing to do. Um, but the flip side of that is that if you're inspecting every line of code in the code base, it's going to go slower and slower and slower over time, unless you become more and more trusting. So if you have a particularly good memory and remembering other pieces of the code base, then maybe you can gain that trust over time. I don't know.
Yeah. That raises a good point. So kind of like the cognitive load impact on efficiency and flow, effectiveness and flow efficiency, right? Because if you're hyper skeptical, let's say,
Mm,
uh, of all names in the code, class names, method names, variable names, you're going to be doing a lot of mental work to break it down into binary, so to speak, to
right.
make it sure to do it everything it does. And what I've noticed is when you're in that mode, uh, it's like you said, things are going to go very slow, right?
Yeah.
Because uh, the impact of whatever change you're going to make, if you're trying to extend or add a feature, or modify or fix a bug or that kind of thing, um, it in my experience gets quite stressful because you're trying to keep a lot in your head to make sure it all works. So I wonder if that's kind of where one step into the extreme abstraction zen, I think, is tests, right? In
Yeah.
that even if I'm trying to think of some of the most ugly legacy code I've ever seen, I'm okay to start trusting the names and that kind of thing, as long as there's tests backing it, right?
Right.
So if I change the code and no tests fail, then I start questioning everything. And then you just start building back little bits of Zen, tiny bits of knowledge, test by test. You just extract out a little piece of the code, test to make sure it does what it does. And then if you've gotten to the right piece of code, then you can do all the work you need to do in that piece of code. And the rest of it is just kind of like, it was how it was and is doing what it was doing before. I don't understand it or, know exactly what it's doing. But we have a new it's kind of the spaghetti and meatballs analogy, right? You have the spaghetti code, you make a meatball and you pull it out, right? Where everything is clean and abstracted and tested and well understood. And so the way out of trying to understand all the code is to not try to understand all the code, you know, um, and start small experiments to gain a little piece of knowledge and then add that knowledge into the test name or the name of the variable and that kind of stuff. Um, and I feel like that's the only way out because I think maybe this is an extreme position, but the trying to understand it all to me just feels like an endless loop of stress and an endless loop of non-flow efficiency. And maybe it really works really well for people, but every time I've seen it demonstrated or I've tried it myself, uh, I feel very lost.
Right.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that I think a very popular interpretation of like what makes a senior developer different from like a more junior developer is that quote of how many lines can you hold in your head at the same time makes you more and more senior. But that would be a direct uh, challenge to that, I guess. And so I can't remember exactly who said that quote, but now it's kind of a funny thing. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess my opinion is kind of showing which end of the spectrum I feel like is more healthy is
Yeah,
because I think I live on the far extreme end of this other end of the spectrum. And I think I found ways to do it where safety isn't low or where isn't high risk, right? So if you
yeah,
just follow, Feathers is working effectively with legacy code, the code can be terrible, but if you little by little add safety, uh, you can stay in this Zen world where you only need to understand a few lines of code at a time, basically. Um, and I think the really cool experience that mobbing has brought to me is how when people read code like that they're on the other end of the spectrum, how offensive that code is. Because it generates so much work for them to try to understand it all.
right.
And that comes to a coaching question. So assuming one end of the spectrum is better than the other, uh, Chris, how have you, pairing or mobbing with someone or influencing others, how have you tried to you know, so to speak, get experiments running where they read code differently than trying to understand it all, or inline every method so they can see, the 100 lines of raw, Python,
Right.
exactly what it's
Uh,
doing.
well, so I guess one place it's worth mentioning because like when we first started talking about this, the first thing I thought about was code reading club, where they
Mm,
do the readings of code and then um, they look at techniques for demystifying unfamiliar code. So
mhm.
we should certainly post a link of that in the show notes. And so it's like read code together and talk about what you see. So that is a piece of it. As far as influence goes, there's certainly both the emotional aspects and the more concrete metrics approaches. And I think that if you're telling somebody like, oh, the way that you read code is wrong, like that obviously is going to be taken very poorly. And it might be either demonstrating alternatives and or finding opportunities to uh, you know comfortably reduce the context. Um, but I think the first thing, like kind of like what I said earlier, I think the first thing I would look for is why is that person afraid of trusting the names, right? If it is something where it's like, oh, I need
Mm.
all of this stuff in line, because I do think that our behaviors, like we want to go fast generally, and the reason we start to go slower is because we learn that speed makes us fall over more. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's like, what is the root of that fear? And then how do you get away from that, right? And so if you have like this really big project, some of it's legacy, some of it's well tested, and is it just that the person's like, I don't know if this touches any of the stuff that's not tested yet, right? Because that could just be a reason to check every single thing, right? And so unless you have 100% tested code base, maybe you'll never get out of that, until you can find clear-cut uh, um, ways to make sure that there's no overlap with the untested code and the tested code, right? So
Mm.
that could be an approach. I don't know.
Nice. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I like it. I think getting to that's to be honest, that's one question I haven't asked a whole lot. Um, I may have asked something in the ballpark of that, and it usually just gets crickets.
Yeah,
Kind of like, can you tell me why when we went into this file, you read each method,
yeah,
in great detail, because like, for example, let's say that you come into a method and it does A, B, C, and D, and the name of the card we're working on is C, right? Like it's like the name of the method is there. That's the thing we're working on. Why do we care about A, B, and D? Like C is the thing we're working on in this code, right? And usually when I ask those kind of questions, it's just kind of crickets, and it almost just feels like to me it's habits for some reason. Like maybe
yeah,
they can't even articulate. Or maybe our psychological safety was in question because they
yeah.
like know me as the extreme, abstractor. um, but and so it often felt to me like habits. Like that's just what I do when I come into a file.
Right.
Um, and so you're right. Like, maybe asking the question, why don't you trust the names? Why someone put a lot of time to put those names in that we're
Right.
just completely ignoring, right?
And then there's another aspect of this too. It could just be
Yeah,
genuine curiosity, right? Like it could be
yeah,
like, I've never seen this file before and I want to go read it.
right, right.
Um, And then you got to ask yourself and the mob, like, is it appropriate to do that now or during learning time or something? Like, just make a note for yourself and go read it
Sure.
when, or something like that. Because certainly, there will always be a point where, too much like diverting the mob is too much, right?
Yeah,
And so, so it could be a genuine, just like, I'm interested in what all this does because it's my first time here, or
yes.
it could be I don't trust anything, and
Yeah.
my missing trust is causing me to do all this. Or it might be something else. Maybe it's,
Hmm.
yeah,
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that's good. And I think you're right. Sometimes it is just genuine curiosity, and other times it's a complaint. Like, why is the code scattered about in their mind, right? Like,
right.
because it's scattered unless it's all together in one place, all, 50 or 100 lines. And so, um, yeah. So I think I don't know. This is an area of learning for me, so maybe we reach out to the audience if you got any tips or tricks.
Right.
I've definitely done what you said, Chris, where it's kind of like demonstrating alternatives. Like,
Right.
hey, next time we read the file, let's try reading it like this, and then I kind of demonstrate it. Um, and or someone, those who feel comfortable with me, are really like, Austin, why in the heck does this, 50 lines split into 10 functions? Like, why would you do such a thing? You know what I mean? Then I explain it and they try it, and then there's kind of like experiments that run, and then there's some changes on both sides for us. But I've seen influence kind of happen that way, just via experimentation and seeing it done a different way. But yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, any other thoughts on this one, Chris?
Yeah. The other thing I think that might that might help in that situation too is just diagramming, right? People have a hard time talking or even reading concepts, and so
Yeah,
drawing pictures, I think, can also help a lot. But
yeah,
yeah, and to our audience, keep the conversation going, chat with us. Uh, you know, If you know somebody, maybe they're on the opposite end of the spectrum as you, maybe share this episode with them. And yeah, thanks for a great topic, Austin. And to our audience, we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.